The well house. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled into what would be my home for the next 3 months. I'd been driving for 6 hours straight from Portland, and the sight of the little white farmhouse nestled between rolling fields made me exhale for what felt like the first time in weeks. This was exactly what I needed: space, quiet, and distance from everything that had gone wrong in my life. I stepped out of my car and stretched, breathing in air that actually smelled clean. No exhaust fumes, no neighbors arguing through thin apartment walls, no reminders of suffocating city life. Just the sound of wind through tall grass and the distant call of some bird I couldn't identify. For the first time since I'd walked out of Dr. Martinez's office with those final test results, I felt like I could actually breathe. The farmhouse was smaller than it had appeared in the online photos, but that was fine. I only needed space for my laptop, my drawing tablet, and enough room to spread out reference materials for the biggest project of my freelance career. 3 months of solitude to nail this contract and prove I could still work, still create, still be useful. Despite what the doctors had told me about my future, a rusty pickup truck approached from the direction of the main road, dust trailing behind it like a brown banner. The landlord, I assumed. Mr. Henley climbed out slowly, the kind of deliberate movement that spoke of arthritic joints and too many years of farm work. He was exactly what Central Casting would order for rural Oregon farmer. Weathered face, flannel shirt, work boots that had seen decades of honest labor. "You must be Maya," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Hope the drive wasn't too rough. GPS tend to take folks the long way out here." "It was fine," I replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm and warm, so different from the sterile handshakes I'd grown accustomed to in waiting rooms and specialists' offices. "The place looks perfect, even better than the photos." Mr. Henley nodded, but something flickered across his expression, too quick for me to interpret. "Well, let's get you settled then. Got the keys right here." He led me up the front steps, pointing out practical details as we went. The propane tank for the stove, the electrical panel in the basement, the quirks of the old plumbing. Standard landlord information, delivered in the patient tone of someone who'd given this tour many times before. "Internet satellite," he mentioned as we stepped inside. "Sometimes gets a little spotty, especially during storms. Phone service too, for that matter. You'll want to keep your cell charged." The interior was cozy in the way only old houses could be. Hardwood floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot, windows that actually opened, built-in shelves that showed decades of careful maintenance. It felt lived in rather than sterile, which was perfect. I could already envision my workspace set up by the large window overlooking the back field. "Previous tenant leave anything behind?" I asked, noticing a few random items. A coffee mug in the sink, a paperback novel on the windowsill. "Ah, yeah," Mr. Henley scratched his beard. "Sarah left in a bit of a hurry. Family emergency back east. Said I could just donate whatever she didn't take. Haven't gotten around to clearing it out yet." We finished the indoor tour and stepped onto the back porch. The view was spectacular, rolling fields dotted with wildflowers, a line of Douglas firs marking the property boundary, and beyond that, the kind of endless forest that made you remember how small you really were. "Beautiful," I murmured, already planning where I'd set up my morning coffee routine. Mr. Henley's voice had changed, becoming more cautious. "Now, there's one thing I need to mention. You see that structure out there, about 50 yards back?" I followed his pointing finger to a small stone building I hadn't noticed before. It was maybe 8 feet square, with a peaked roof and a heavy wooden door. Ivy had claimed most of the walls, making it look like something from a fairy tale. "That's the old well house," he continued. "Been there since my grandfather's time. Doors locked for safety reasons. The well inside goes down pretty deep, and we don't want anyone falling in." "Of course," I said. "Is the water still good?" "Oh no, no. House has been on municipal water for decades. The old well's well, it's just old. Point is, I'd appreciate if you stayed clear of it. Foundation's not what it used to be, and I'd hate for you to get hurt poking around." Something in his tone made me look at him more carefully. He was staring at the well house with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not fear exactly, but definitely unease. "No problem," I assured him. "I'm here to work anyway, not explore." "Good, good." He seemed to relax slightly. "Well then, I think that covers everything. My number's on the refrigerator if you need anything. Nearest grocery store's in Millbrook, about 20 minutes back toward the highway." After he left, I spent the afternoon unloading my car and getting settled. The previous tenant, Sarah, had good taste. The furniture was comfortable without being fancy, and she'd left behind a decent coffee maker and some basic kitchen supplies. I found a few more of her belongings scattered around, a sweater draped over a chair, a half-used bottle of shampoo in the shower, a small stack of books on the nightstand. It really did seem like she'd left in a hurry. As evening approached, I set up my workspace by the back window and fired up my laptop to check email. I made myself dinner from supplies I'd brought. That's when I first heard it. A soft rhythmic sound from outside. Metal on metal, like someone tapping a wrench against a pipe. I glanced out the window, but the backfield was empty, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. The sound continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. Probably just the old well house settling, I told myself. Old buildings made all kinds of noises. I worked until nearly midnight making good progress on the initial concepts. The isolation was already proving beneficial. No distractions, no interruptions, just me and the work. I brushed my teeth, changed into pajamas, and climbed into the surprisingly comfortable bed. I was almost asleep when my laptop chimed with an email notification. Annoyed with myself for forgetting to turn off notifications, I grabbed my phone to check the time. 3:17 a.m. That was weird. I'd only been in bed for maybe 20 minutes. The email was spam anyway, something about extending my car warranty. I deleted it and rolled over, but now I was wide awake. The bedroom was completely dark except for the faint glow of my phone, and utterly silent except for... There it was again. That metallic tapping sound coming from the direction of the well house. I lay there listening for several minutes, but the sound didn't repeat. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off to sleep, thinking I'd have to ask Mr. Henley about it in the morning. The next day dawned bright and clear, perfect for a morning run before diving into work. I'd always been an early riser, and the rural setting seemed to demand greeting the sunrise properly. I laced up my running shoes and headed out the front door, planning to explore the property boundaries. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying scents of grass and wildflowers that made my city-accustomed lungs feel grateful. I jogged along what looked like an old farm road, now mostly overgrown, that led toward the tree line. That's when I found the first one. It was small, maybe 3 inches tall, carved from what looked like pine, a simple human figure, arms at its sides, face smooth and featureless. Someone had placed it carefully on a tree stump, positioned so it faced the house. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The carving was crude but deliberate, the kind of thing someone might make during long winter evenings. A folk art piece, maybe left behind by a previous tenant or a local kid. I pocketed the figure and continued my run, but found two more before I made it back to the house. Both were identical to the first, both positioned to face the farmhouse. By the time I got back, I had 3 wooden figures and a growing sense of curiosity. Over coffee, I examined them more carefully. They were definitely handmade, carved with simple tools. The wood was weathered, but not ancient. These had been exposed to the elements for months, not years. Sarah's work, maybe, some kind of art project. I set them on the kitchen windowsill and forgot about them until that evening when I was cleaning up dinner. The internet had cut out again at exactly 3:17 a.m. the night before. I checked my phone when the email notification woke me up and the Wi-Fi symbol had been grayed out. Now, as I rinsed dishes, I glanced out at the well house and noticed something that made me pause. The metallic sound was back, but this time I could see what was causing it. The door of the well house was moving slightly, as if something inside was pushing against it in a steady rhythm. Push, pause, push, pause. The heavy padlock clinked against the metal hasp with each movement. I dried my hands and stepped onto the back porch for a better look. The door was definitely moving, maybe an inch each time, enough to make the lock hardware rattle, but there was no wind. The evening air was perfectly still. As I watched, the movement stopped abruptly. The well house stood silent and motionless, as if it had never moved at all. Probably just the wood expanding and contracting with temperature changes, I told myself. Old buildings did that. The door probably didn't fit the frame perfectly anymore, and the daily heating and cooling cycle made it shift. But even as I rationalized it away, I found myself staring at the well house longer than necessary, waiting to see if it would move again. It didn't, at least not while I was watching. That night, I made sure to turn off all email notifications before going to bed, but I still woke up at 3:17 a.m. anyway, pulled from sleep by some internal alarm I couldn't explain. The room was dark and quiet, and when I checked my phone, the Wi-Fi was down again. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the old house settle around me, and tried not to think about the rhythmic tapping that had started up again outside my window. By the end of my first week, I'd fallen into a comfortable routine. Coffee at sunrise, morning run through the fields, work until late afternoon, then dinner and more work until I couldn't keep my eyes open. The isolation was working exactly as I'd hoped. The internet still cut out every night at 3:17 a.m., but I'd learned to work around it. I saved my files religiously and stopped checking email after midnight. The metallic sounds from the well house had become part of the background noise, like the settling of old wood or the distant hum of the refrigerator. I barely noticed them anymore. What I did notice was that the wooden figures kept multiplying. Every few days, I'd find new ones during my morning runs, always positioned to face the house, always carved in the same crude style. I'd collected 8 so far, lining them up on the kitchen windowsill like a tiny wooden army. Sarah must have been quite the prolific carver, I thought. It was during my second week that I found the journal. I'd been reorganizing the bedroom, moving Sarah's leftover books to make room for my own things, when I noticed the floorboard by the window was slightly raised. When I pressed on it, it shifted with a soft creak. Curious, I worked my fingers into the gap and lifted the board. Underneath was a small space, probably carved out decades ago to hide valuables. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, but the writing still clear. The first entry was dated 3 months earlier, written in careful cursive, March 15th. Finally got settled in the farmhouse. It's perfect for what I need. Quiet, isolated, good light for painting. Mr. Henley seems nice enough, though he got oddly specific about staying away from the old well house, as if I'd want to go poking around some crumbling outbuilding anyway. I flipped through several pages of mundane entries, notes about work projects, observations about wildlife, complaints about the spotty internet. Then the tone began to shift. March 28th. Keep finding these strange little wooden figures around the property. They're kind of charming in a way. The carving is primitive, but there's something almost deliberate about their placement. Always facing the house, like they're watching. April 2nd. The internet has been cutting out every night at exactly 3:17 a.m. Called the provider, but they say there's no scheduled maintenance. Probably just the satellite adjusting or something. Rural living, I guess. April 8th. Had the strangest dream last night. I was standing by a well, drawing up bucket after bucket of water, but the buckets were always empty when they reached the top. There was someone behind me, whispering instructions I couldn't quite understand. Woke up with dirt under my fingernails. I set the journal aside, feeling oddly uncomfortable. Sarah's experiences sounded exactly like mine, down to the 3:17 a.m. internet outages, but dreams about wells? I tried to remember if I'd had any unusual dreams since arriving, but mostly I'd been sleeping deeply, exhausted from the long work days. That night, I found myself paying closer attention to the sounds from the well house. They seemed more complex now, less like random settling and more like rhythm, as if something was moving in there with purpose, following a pattern I couldn't quite grasp. I made myself tea and returned to Sarah's journal, reading by lamplight. April 15th. The sounds from the well house are getting louder, or maybe I'm just becoming more aware of them. It's not random creaking, there's definitely a pattern. 3 short taps, pause, 2 long ones, pause, repeat. Like Morse code, but not any sequence I recognize. April 20th. Found muddy footprints on the back porch this morning, barefoot, huge, and oddly placed. They were pointing the wrong way, toward the house from the direction of the well house, then back again, as if someone had walked from there to here, then returned, but there's no one living nearby. April 25th. The dreams are getting more vivid. Always the same scene, drawing water from a well that never fills the bucket. But now I can hear the voice more clearly. It's not asking me to bring something up from the depths, it's telling me I'm going to go down. My hands were trembling slightly as I turned the page. This was getting too specific, too similar to my own experience. But I'd never had dreams about wells, had I? May 1st. Broke down and called Mr. Henley about the sounds. He got very agitated, kept insisting I stay away from the well house. When I pressed him about it, he said something about old agreements and keeping it fed. Then he seemed to realize what he'd said and claimed he was just talking about keeping raccoons out of the garbage. May 8th. The wooden figures are moving, not on their own. Something is dragging them around at night. I watched from the window and saw them being pulled across the yard by some invisible force, their wooden bodies scraping against the ground. In the morning, they're always in new positions, closer to the house. I closed the journal and walked to the kitchen window. My collection of wooden figures sat on the sill, motionless in the lamplight. 8 crude, little people, all facing inward toward the house. They looked innocent enough, like the kind of craft project you'd find at a county fair. But as I stared at them, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. They weren't in the same positions I'd left them that morning. They'd been spread out along the windowsill, evenly spaced. Now they were clustered together in the center, as if something had pushed them into a huddle. I reached out to touch one, then pulled my hand back. My rational mind insisted they must have shifted when I'd been cleaning, or maybe vibrations from closing the window had moved them. But Sarah's words echoed in my head, being pulled across the yard by some invisible force. That night, I woke at 3:17 a.m. as usual, but this time I was ready. I'd set my phone to record video, positioned to capture the wooden figures on the windowsill. If something was moving them, I'd have proof. But when I checked the recording in the morning, it showed 8 hours of motionless figures. Nothing had disturbed them during the night. Yet when I looked at the windowsill, they were gone. I found them outside, arranged in a perfect circle around the well house. Standing in the morning dew, barefoot in my pajamas, I stared at the ring of carved figures. Each one faced inward toward the stone building, as if they were standing guard. The grass around them was disturbed, showing clear drag marks where they'd been pulled across the field. The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Someone was playing an elaborate prank. The local kids had found my collection and decided to mess with the city girl, but who? I hadn't seen another human being since Mr. Henley's visit 2 weeks ago. I gathered the figures and brought them back inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was interrupting something important. As I placed them back on the windowsill, I noticed one was different from the others. The carving was more detailed, with tiny scratches that might have been facial features, and unlike the others, this one wasn't facing the house, it was facing me. That afternoon, I called the sheriff's office in Millbrook. The dispatcher listened patiently as I explained about the wooden figures and the sounds from the well house, though I left out the parts about them being dragged around, even to my own ears. It sounded paranoid and disconnected from reality. "Ma'am, sounds like you might be experiencing some cabin fever," the deputy said kindly. "Happens to folks who aren't used to rural isolation. Kids do like to play pranks on newcomers, and old buildings make all kinds of noises. Why don't you get out more? Maybe drive into town for dinner." But getting out felt impossible, and besides, something was keeping me here. Not fear exactly, but a growing sense that I was part of something larger than myself, that leaving now would mean abandoning some crucial responsibility I didn't yet understand. Sarah's journal had more entries, but I was almost afraid to read them. Instead, I threw myself into work, staying up later and later, trying to ignore the increasingly complex sounds from the well house. The 3-tap, 2-tap pattern had evolved into something longer, more intricate. Sometimes it sounded almost like music. On my third Friday at the farmhouse, I woke not at 3:17 a.m., but at 2:45. Something had pulled me from sleep, not the usual internet notification, but a different kind of awareness. The house felt different, charged with an energy I couldn't name. I got up and padded to the kitchen for water, not bothering to turn on lights. The moon was full, casting everything in silver. As I reached for a glass, I glanced out at the well house and froze. The door was open. I stood at the sink, glass in hand, staring at the dark rectangle where the door should have been. The heavy padlock that Mr. Henley had shown me was supposed to keep it secure, hung open on its hasp. But I could see into the building, and there was nothing there but deeper darkness. As I watched, something pale moved in the shadows inside, not quite human-shaped, but close enough to make my heart race. It seemed to be climbing, hand over hand, pulling itself up from some great depth. I blinked, and the door was closed again. The padlock hung in place, as if it had never been disturbed. But the image was burned into my mind, that pale, ascending figure, the sense of something emerging from far below. I returned to bed, but sleep didn't come. Instead, I lay awake, listening to the sounds from the well house, which had changed again. Now they sounded less like tapping and more like scraping, as if something was clawing its way up through stone. The next morning, I found muddy footprints on my back porch. They were large and bare, just as Sarah had described in her journal, but seeing them myself was different from reading about them. The prints were too distinct to be imagination, too deliberate to be accidental. Someone, or something, had walked from the direction of the well house to my door, stood there for a while, then returned the same way. I followed the trail across the dew-soaked grass. The prints were clear in the soft earth, each toe individually visible. They led directly to the well house, then simply stopped at the closed door. With shaking hands, I called Mr. Henley. "Footprints, you say?" His voice was carefully neutral. "Probably just some kids from town. They like to explore the old properties." "Barefoot kids? At 3 in the morning?" There was a long pause. "Maya, I think maybe you should consider coming back to town for a few days. Take a break from the isolation. Sometimes the mind can play tricks when you're alone too long." But I couldn't leave, not now. And not when every instinct I had was screaming that something important was happening here, something that required my presence. That night, I decided to stay awake and watch. I made coffee, positioned myself at the kitchen table with a clear view of the well house, and waited. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the internet went down as usual, but this time, something else happened. Welcome, sleepwalkers. Make sure to lock your doors. Please like and subscribe before you pass out. Here's today's video. The Well House, Part 2. I heard scraping sounds from outside, not from the well house, but from the yard itself. Looking out the window, I watched in horrified fascination as the wooden figures began to move. But they weren't walking or moving under their own power. Instead, they were being dragged across the ground by some hidden string, their wooden bodies scraping against the earth as they were pulled toward the well house. One by one, they arranged themselves in their familiar circle around the stone building. But this time, I could see what happened next. The door of the well house swung open, revealing not the innocent stone interior I'd glimpsed during the day, but something else entirely. The space inside seemed vast, extending down into darkness that my eyes couldn't penetrate, and from that darkness, something was climbing up. It took forever, whatever it was. I could hear the scraping of fingers or claws against stone, the wet sound of something pulling itself hand over hand up an impossible distance. The wooden figures stood motionless around the perimeter, like tiny sentinels keeping watch. Finally, pale fingers appeared at the edge of the well house doorway, then a hand, then an arm. What emerged was almost human, but wrong in ways that made my mind recoil. Too thin, too pale, joints bending in directions that shouldn't be possible. Its face was a blank expanse of white, with dark hollows where eyes should have been. The thing stood in the doorway of the well house, swaying slightly as if testing its balance in the upper world. Then it turned toward my house with unerring accuracy, though it had no visible eyes to see me with. I scrambled backward from the window, knocking over my coffee mug, but I couldn't stop watching. The pale figure began to walk across the field, its movement wrong and jerky, leaving deep gouges in the earth with each step. Behind it, the wooden figures were being dragged along in formation, their carved bodies bouncing and scraping across the ground as they followed. They were coming to the house. I ran to the front door and checked the locks, then did the same with the back door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the deadbolts. But what protection were locks against something that could manipulate objects without touching them? The footsteps on the back porch were soft but deliberate. I heard the thing testing the door handle, then moving to the windows. It was looking for a way in, and I had the terrible certainty that it would find one. But as the first light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, the sound stopped. I crept to the window and saw the pale figure walking back toward the well house, the wooden figures being dragged behind it in their orderly procession. By the time the sun was fully up, they had all disappeared back into whatever depths they'd emerged from. I found Sarah's journal and read the rest of her entries with growing dread. May 12th. It came to the house last night. I saw it clearly, pale, wrong, not quite human. The wooden figures were being pulled behind it like some kind of funeral procession. It tried all the doors and windows but couldn't get in. I think there's some rule that keeps it out. Unless... May 15th. Found a section of the basement wall that's different from the rest. Newer stone, different mortar. Something was walled up down there, and recently. The sound of scratching comes from behind it sometimes. May 18th. The dreams are constant now. In them, I'm not drawing water from the well. I'm going down into it. Something is waiting for me in the depths. Something that feeds on more than just flesh. It wants to preserve what it consumes, to keep the essence trapped forever. May 20th. I understand now. The well house isn't just a building, it's a feeding chamber. And the thing that lives down there needs someone to sustain it, to keep it strong enough to honor the old agreement. The wooden figures aren't decorations. They're the souls of everyone who came before. May 22nd. Last night I found myself walking toward the well house without consciously deciding to go. The pale thing was waiting for me, holding out something that looked like a wooden figure but was different from the others. This one had a face carved into it. My face. When I woke up this morning, it was on my nightstand. The final entry was dated just a week before I'd arrived, May 25th. I can't fight it anymore. Every night I get closer to the well house. The pale thing is patient but insistent. It shows me the carved figure with my face, and I understand what it means. My body will feed the creature, but my soul will be preserved in the wood, forced to watch and wait as others are brought to take my place. I'm leaving tonight while I still can, but I know it will follow me. The agreement must be maintained. Someone else will come, someone who can see the wooden figures for what they really are. God forgive me for what I'm bringing to whoever comes next. I set the journal down with trembling hands. Sarah had left me here to face this alone, but what exactly was I facing? And what was this agreement she'd mentioned? That night, I didn't even pretend to try sleeping. I sat at the kitchen table with every light in the house blazing, watching the well house. At 3:17 a.m., the internet went down, and the wooden figures began their nightly procession. But this time, when the pale thing emerged from the well house, it was carrying something. A wooden figure, more detailed than the others. Even from a distance, I could see it had a carved face. My face. I couldn't take it anymore. The next morning, after another sleepless night of watching the pale thing circle my house with its wooden army, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I was going to break into the well house. Mr. Henley had said the foundation was unstable, but I'd been watching the building for weeks now. It was solid stone, probably built to last centuries. Whatever he was trying to keep me away from, it wasn't structural damage. I found a crowbar in the basement and waited until midday, when the sun was brightest and my courage was highest. The walk across the field felt like miles, even though I knew it was only 50 yards. The wooden figures were back on my windowsill. I'd found them there that morning, arranged in their usual watching formation. The padlock was old but solid. It took me 20 minutes of prying and swearing before it finally snapped. The door swung open with a groan of ancient hinges, revealing nothing like what I'd expected. The interior was much larger than the outside walls suggested, extending back into pitch-black shadows. But it wasn't the size that made my breath catch, it was the walls. Every surface was covered in carved symbols, layer upon layer of them, as if generations of people had added their marks over decades or centuries. Some looked Native American, others resembled Celtic knots or Norse runes, and still others were unlike anything I'd ever seen. And in the center of the room was the well. It was perfectly circular, lined with fitted stones that descended into absolute darkness. No matter how I strained my eyes, I couldn't see the bottom, but I could hear something down there, a wet, sliding sound, like something large moving through water. Around the rim of the well, someone had arranged fresh animal bones, rabbit skulls, deer ribs, the hollow skeleton of what might have been a raccoon. They formed a perfect circle, and each bone was carved with the same symbols that covered the walls. I knelt by the well's edge and looked down. The darkness was so complete, it seemed solid, like black velvet. But as I stared, I began to see faint shapes moving in the depths. Something pale, with too many joints, climbing slowly upward. A sound behind me made me spin around. In the doorway of the well house stood Mr. Henley, but not as I'd ever seen him before. His face was haggard, his eyes hollow with the weight of terrible knowledge. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Not until you understand what you're part of." "What agreement?" I managed to whisper. Mr. Henley stepped into the well house, his movements careful and deliberate. "This land was purchased with promises, Maya. My great-great-grandfather made a deal with what lives below. Protection for the town, bountiful harvests, mild winters, prosperity for generations. In exchange, we provide what it needs." I backed toward the well, which seemed like a mistake the moment I did it. "Provide what?" "Sustenance." His gaze was filled with sorrow. "The creature down there is ancient, older than the town, older than the first settlers. It feeds on human flesh, but that's not all it takes. It preserves the soul, traps it in carved wood to serve as eternal guardians." "The wooden figures," I whispered. "Every person who's been offered to maintain the agreement. Their bodies feed the creature, but their essence lives on in the wood, bound to watch over the boundary between our world and its hunger." I looked down into the well again. The pale shape was much closer now, maybe 20 feet below the rim. I could see its face clearly, smooth white skin stretched over a skull that was possibly a different species of human. Its mouth was a dark gash, filled with needle-sharp teeth. "I won't do it," I said. "I won't be your sacrifice." Mr. Henley's expression was infinitely sad. "You already are, child. The moment you arranged the wooden figures on your windowsill, you accepted the role. The moment you found Sarah's journal and didn't run, you committed yourself. The creature has been feeding on your dreams for weeks, learning your essence, preparing to preserve you. As if summoned by his words, the pale thing's hand appeared at the rim of the well. Its fingers were impossibly long, ending in black claws that scraped against the stone. I stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The town depends on this agreement, Mr. Henley continued, his voice becoming more urgent. Before we started feeding it, the creature would emerge on its own. Whole families disappeared in the night. Children were found drained of blood, their bodies twisted into impossible shapes. Livestock died by the hundreds. Crops failed year after year. The pale thing hauled itself up over the rim of the well with fluid grace. Standing, it was nearly 7 feet tall, its elongated limbs giving it the appearance of a spider that had learned to walk upright. When it turned toward me, I saw that its face wasn't blank after all. There were eyes, dark and deep as the well itself, filled with an intelligence that was older than anything people had ever built on this land. But with the agreement, Mr. Henley said, the town thrives. Our children are safe, our harvests are plentiful. One life every so often in exchange for the prosperity of hundreds. The creature moved toward me with deliberate slowness, as if it had all the time in the world. Its gaze never left my face, and I could feel something cold probing at the edges of my mind. Sarah tried to run, I said desperately. She got away. Mr. Henley shook his head sadly. Sarah never left the property. She's in the basement of the farmhouse, behind the newer stones. It's where I put all the girls that won't cooperate. Her soul joined the Wooden Watchers the night she tried to escape in her own way. But you will serve your purpose. What purpose? I asked. To keep the creature fed and content until the next caretaker arrives. The pale thing reached out one impossibly long arm and touched my forehead with a finger that felt like ice. Images flooded my mind, visions of the town's founding, of Mr. Henley's great-great-grandfather signing papers in his own blood, of decades of carefully selected sacrifices. I saw Sarah weeping with a razor blade in her hand as she bled out, choosing not to feed the creature, and I saw myself standing at the rim of the well in the gray light of dawn, my body growing cold as the creature fed, my consciousness slowly transferring to carved wood where it would remain forever. The process is painless, Mr. Henley said gently, and you'll still be aware, still be part of something important. The town will remember you as a saint. The pale thing smiled with its terrible mouth and began to guide me towards the well. But before it could complete the ritual, voices echoed from outside, car doors slamming, people calling my name. Maya, Maya, are you here? They weren't supposed to come. Mr. Henley's face went pale. The creature's head snapped toward the sound, its dark eyes narrowing. For the first time since I'd seen it, the thing looked genuinely agitated. It released my arm and moved to the well house doorway, peering out at the approaching voices. Maya, we tried calling but couldn't reach you. The voice was closer now, maybe halfway across the field. We have some revisions to discuss. Mr. Henley grabbed my arm roughly. You have to get rid of them. Send them away, or they'll all become part of this. The creature won't tolerate witnesses. I looked at the pale thing, which had begun to make a low rumbling sound in its throat. Its fingers were flexing, claws extending and retracting as if it was preparing to hunt. Tell them you're sick, Mr. Henley hissed. Tell them anything, but make them leave. I stumbled toward the doorway on shaking legs. Through the opening, I could see 3 people in business attire picking their way across the field toward the well house. My clients, people who had trusted me with their biggest rebrand in company history. I'm here, I called out, my voice cracking. But this isn't a good time. Maya? The lead voice belonged to Janet, the marketing director. We were worried when you didn't respond to our emails. Are you all right? Behind me, the creature had retreated back toward the well, but its agitation was growing. The rumbling in its throat had become a low growl, and I could feel malevolent hunger radiating from it like heat. I'm fine, I shouted. Just working on the project. Can we reschedule for next week? But they were still approaching. Through the doorway, I could see Janet's concerned expression. I could see the way she was looking at the well house with professional curiosity. Is that some kind of historical building? She called. It's fascinating. Mind if we take a quick look? The creature let out a sound that made my bones ache. Part shriek, part roar. Utterly inhuman. Mr. Henley grabbed my shoulder. They're not leaving, he said desperately. It's going to kill them all, Maya. You have to... But I was already moving. I pushed past him and ran toward the well house entrance, shouting warnings even as I heard the creature's footsteps behind me. Run! Get back to your car. There's something wrong here. Janet and her team stopped, confusion replacing curiosity on their faces. But they were too close now, close enough to see into the well house, close enough to see the pale figure that emerged behind me with its impossible limbs and needle teeth. What happened next was chaos, screaming, running, the creature moving with fluid grace as it pursued the fleeing business people across the field. Mr. Henley was shouting something about the agreement being broken, about consequences that would fall on the entire town. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was running too, following Janet and her team toward their rental car, praying we could all reach it before the creature caught us. We almost made it. The creature took Janet first, its elongated arms reaching her. Just as she reached for the car door handle, her screams cut off abruptly as those terrible claws found their mark, and then she was being dragged back toward the well house with inhuman speed. The other two, David from accounting and Sarah from design, made it to the car. I dove into the back seat as David fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip them. What was that thing? Sarah sobbed from the passenger seat. What the hell was that? Drive, I gasped. Just drive. The engine roared to life and David floored the accelerator, gravel spraying as we tore down the long driveway. In the rear window, I could see the pale creature standing in the field, Janet's motionless form at its feet. It wasn't pursuing us anymore. It was simply watching, those dark eyes fixed on our fleeing car with what might have been satisfaction. We made it to town in record time, screeching to a halt in front of the sheriff's office. But when we stumbled inside, gasping out our story of monsters and murder, the deputy's expression grew carefully neutral. Now folks, I know Maya here has been having some troubles with isolation, he said patiently. Sometimes the mind can play tricks when you're alone too long. Are you sure you didn't just see a bear? They can look mighty strange when they rear up on their hind legs. A bear? David's voice cracked. That thing was 7 feet tall and white as bone. It killed Janet. The deputy nodded sympathetically and made notes that I was sure would never be filed. Tell you what, why don't we all drive out there together and take a look? I'm sure we'll find a reasonable explanation. But when we returned to the farmhouse an hour later, there was no sign of Janet or the creature. The well house door was closed and padlocked, exactly as it had been when I'd first arrived. The wooden figures sat peacefully on my kitchen windowsill, facing inward toward the house. The only evidence that anything had happened was a dark stain on the ground near the well house that the deputy dismissed as old motor oil. Sometimes traumatic experiences can cause shared hallucinations, he explained to David and Sarah as they stared at the innocent-looking stone building. Group hysteria, they call it, happens more often than you'd think. David and Sarah left that evening, shaken and confused, but apparently convinced that they'd somehow imagined the whole thing. The human mind, I realized, had a remarkable ability to rationalize away the impossible, but I knew what I'd seen, and I knew what Mr. Henley had told me about the agreement. That night, I packed my things with grim determination. I would leave this place, return to Portland, and never look back. Let Mr. Henley find another sacrifice to maintain his town's prosperity. I was done being part of their ancient bargain, but when I reached for my car keys, my hand stopped midway to the hook by the door. I tried again, but my arm simply wouldn't obey. The compulsion was already too strong. Instead, I found myself walking to the kitchen table, where a piece of wood and a carving knife had appeared while I was in town. Without conscious thought, my hands began to work, guided by skills I didn't know I possessed. The face that emerged from the wood was my own, but changed. Older, sadder, with eyes that had seen too much. When it was finished, I set it on the windowsill with the others and noticed something that chilled me to the bone. One of the figures had Janet's face now, her features carved with the same resigned despair I'd seen in all the others. Over the following days, I tried calling the authorities, tried contacting anyone who might listen to my story, but every time I reached for the phone, the compulsion had stopped me. The creature had marked me, claimed me, and there was no escaping the role I'd been chosen to play. My old life felt distant now, like memories from someone else's existence. What mattered was the rhythm of the well house, the nightly emergence of the pale thing, the careful maintenance of the boundary that kept the ancient hunger from consuming everything. At dawn and dusk, I found myself walking to the well house with offerings. The creature accepted them graciously, its terrible smile never changing, but I could see in its ancient eyes that it was still hungry, that eventually it would require more substantial feeding. The wooden figures watched everything from their posts around the property. During the day they stood motionless, but at night I could see them being dragged into new positions by unnamed forces, maintaining their vigil. Sometimes I thought I could hear them whispering to each other in voices like wind through pine needles. 3 weeks after Janet's disappearance, Mr. Henley came to visit. He found me in the garden, tending vegetables I didn't remember planting. "The town council is pleased with how you've adapted," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "The crops are coming in better than they have in years. The children are sleeping soundly. Even the weather has been unusually mild." I nodded but didn't look up from the tomatoes. "How many others have there been?" "Caretakers, dozens, over the decades. Some last longer than others. You seem particularly suited to the role. Because I don't fight it anymore? Because you understand what's at stake." He gestured toward the town visible in the distance. One person's sacrifice in exchange for the well-being of so many. It's not such a terrible trade. But I wasn't listening to his justifications anymore. I was thinking about the carved figure with my face, sitting on the windowsill with all the others, waiting for the day when my body would feed the creature and my consciousness would transfer to the wood, leaving me trapped forever in a prison of carved pine. That night, I found myself unconsciously adding details to the wooden figure, deepening the lines around the eyes, refining the expression of sorrow. When I was finished, I placed it back on the windowsill and noticed that all the other figures had turned to face it. They were welcoming me home. Outside, the pale creature began its nightly climb from the depths, ready for another day of patient watching, patient feeding, patient maintenance of the agreement that bound us all. I stood at the window and watched it emerge, no longer afraid, but not yet resigned. The town slept peacefully in the distance, their children safe in their beds, their crops growing strong in the fertile soil. The price of their prosperity stood in my kitchen, carved in wood and watching with dead eyes. Soon, I thought, very soon now, I would join them, but not tonight. Tonight I would sit and write, adding my own entries to Sarah's journal, leaving a record for whoever came next. Maybe they would be stronger than I was. Maybe they would find a way to break the cycle that had claimed so many before me. Or maybe they would simply join the circle, as we all did eventually. The pale creature smiled at me through the window, and I found myself smiling back, feeling my humanity slip away one careful piece at a time. My fingers moved to the wooden knife waiting on the table, ready for the final carving that would complete my transformation. The wooden figures watched from their posts, patient and eternal, their vigil never ending. And somewhere in the depths of the well, ancient hunger stirred and settled, satisfied for now but always waiting, always ready for the next offering that would keep the old agreement alive. The house was quiet except for the distant sound of scraping stone, as something far below began its long climb toward the surface once again. The night light. Moving into the duplex felt like a fresh start. After the divorce, I needed somewhere cheap and quiet to rebuild my life. The place was perfect, a small 2-bedroom in an older neighborhood, with my half separated from the other unit by a thin wall. My neighbor seemed nice enough during our brief introduction. Sarah, mid-30s, worked nights at the hospital. She had a daughter, maybe 5 or 6 years old, with the biggest brown eyes I'd ever seen. The first few weeks were blissfully normal. I'd settled into a routine of working my remote job during the day, then unwinding with Netflix in the evenings. The walls were thin enough that I could occasionally hear movement from next door, but nothing disruptive. Just the gentle sounds of domestic life, footsteps, muffled television, the occasional closing door. It was around the 3rd week that I first noticed the light. I'd gotten up around 2 a.m. to use the bathroom when I saw it, seeping under the gap beneath my bedroom wall. A soft, yellowish glow, like a night light. It made sense. Sarah's daughter probably needed one to sleep. I thought nothing of it and went back to bed, but the light was there the next night too, and the next. Always the same warm yellow, always steady, never flickering like a candle or shifting like a television screen. Just a constant, unwavering presence bleeding through the wall. I mentioned it to Sarah one morning when we happened to leave for work at the same time. She paused, her hand on her car door, a strange expression crossing her face. "Nightlight," she said slowly. "What exactly are you seeing?" "Just a yellow glow under the wall. Figured Emma might need one to sleep." Sarah's grip tightened on her keys. "Emma doesn't use one anymore. She outgrew it months ago." She was quiet for a moment, staring at the ground. "You said it's yellow?" "Yeah, warm yellow, like those old incandescent bulbs. That's the same color Emma's used to be." She shook her head quickly. "But I threw it out when we moved in, said it was for babies." "Maybe you forgot about another lamp. These old places can be tricky." "No." Her voice was firm, almost defensive. "I know every inch of that apartment. There's no light in that room." She got in her car, then rolled down the window. "Are you sure you're seeing it from Emma's room?" "I think so. The wall between our bedrooms." Sarah's face went pale. "That's not Emma's room. That's the spare room. It's been empty since we moved in." She drove away before I could ask any more questions. The light continued for another week, always there when I went to bed, always gone by morning. I started to find it oddly comforting, like having a gentle companion in the darkness. It reminded me of childhood, of feeling safe and protected. Then Emma started crying. The first time, I almost didn't hear it over the sound of my fan. A soft whimpering, barely audible, through the wall. It lasted maybe 10 minutes before stopping. I felt bad for Sarah. Night shifts were hard enough without a child having nightmares. But it happened again the next night, and the next. Always around the same time, always the same quiet, heartbroken sobbing. The yellow light would glow steadily throughout, never dimming or brightening, just maintaining its warm presence while the child cried. I saw Sarah in the hallway a few days later, looking exhausted. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she moved with the sluggish weight of someone running on empty. "Rough nights?" I asked gently. She looked confused, almost startled. "What do you mean?" "Emma's been having some bad dreams, I think. I've heard her crying through the wall." Sarah stopped dead, her face draining of color. "Crying? What kind of crying?" "Just sad crying, like a scared kid. It's been happening around 2 in the morning." "That's impossible." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Emma's been staying at her father's house for the past 2 weeks. She won't be back until next month." The bottom dropped out of my stomach. "Are you sure?" "Of course I'm sure. She's my daughter." Sarah's voice carried a sharp edge, but her hands were shaking. "And even if she were here, her room is on the other side of the apartment. You wouldn't hear anything from your bedroom." "Then what?" "How long have you been hearing this?" she interrupted, stepping closer. "How long exactly?" "Maybe a week. It's always the same time, always the same duration." Sarah's breathing quickened. "Always the same? Like exactly the same?" "Yeah, about 12 minutes each time." "Why?" She backed away from me, her keys jangling in her trembling hands. "I need to go." "Sarah, wait. I can't talk about this right now." She fumbled with her apartment lock. "Please, just try to ignore it. Whatever you're hearing, just ignore it." I apologized and retreated to my apartment, mind racing. If Emma wasn't there, what was I hearing? Could it be coming from somewhere else? The walls in these old places were notoriously thin. Maybe the sound was carrying from another unit or from outside. But Sarah's reaction told me she knew something she wasn't sharing. But that night, I pressed my ear against the wall and listened carefully. The crying was definitely coming from directly on the other side, from the room that should have been empty. I started documenting everything. The light appeared every night at 11:47 p.m. Always the same intensity and color. The crying began at 2:15 a.m. and lasted exactly 12 minutes. I timed it obsessively, taking notes, looking for patterns. The crying was getting clearer too. What had started as muffled whimpers was becoming more distinct. I could make out words sometimes. "Mama," and "please," and something that sounded like "hurts." The voice was definitely a child's, high and frightened, with that particular quality that comes from crying so hard you can barely breathe. I started losing sleep. Every night I'd lie awake, waiting for 11:47, watching for that yellow glow. Then I'd count the hours until 2:15, when the crying would begin. I'd press my ear to the wall and listen, trying to understand what was happening in that empty room. It was during the 4th week that I first heard the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps that creaked across the floor next door. They started around midnight, pacing back and forth, back and forth. The pattern was methodical, almost ritualistic. 10 steps toward the front of the room. Pause. 10 steps back. Pause. Over and over. For hours. The steps would stop, just before the crying began. Then, after exactly 12 minutes of sobbing, they would resume, the same measured pace, the same 10-step pattern, continuing until just before dawn. I knocked on Sarah's door the next morning, but she didn't answer. Her car was gone. I waited until evening and tried again. Still nothing. I didn't see her for 3 days. When she finally returned, she looked worse than before. Her hand shook when she unlocked her door, and she avoided making eye contact. "Sarah, are you okay? I haven't seen you around." "I've been staying at my sister's." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I can't sleep here anymore." "Why not?" She looked at me with haunted eyes, then glanced nervously at her apartment door. "You haven't heard it, the walking." My blood turned to ice. "You hear it too?" "Every night, back and forth, back and forth." She wrapped her arms around herself. "It stops whenever I try to investigate, like it knows I'm listening." "How long has this been going on?" "Since the day after you moved in." She paused, studying my face. "You've been hearing it too, haven't you? That's why you're asking." I nodded slowly, and I still hear the crying. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I didn't want to admit it at the time, but you know about the crying. I've been hearing it for weeks, always at the same time, always the same duration. But Emma's not here. She's been gone for... Sarah stopped, her face crumbling. "Oh God, what if something happened to her? What if she's trying to tell me something?" "Sarah, you just said she's safe at her father's." "I know what I said," she snapped, then immediately looked ashamed. "I'm sorry. I called him yesterday, 3 times. Emma's fine. She's happy there. She doesn't even know about..." She gestured vaguely at the building. "About what?" Sarah looked around the empty hallway, then leaned closer. "I called the landlord about the history of this place. Did you know someone died here?" I shook my head. "A little girl, about Emma's age. It was maybe 15 years ago. She lived in the unit that's now yours." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "They found her in the room that shares a wall with your bedroom. She'd been dead for 3 days." "How did she die?" "Her father was... he wasn't well. After her mother left, he started drinking, became violent. The neighbors complained about shouting, but no one ever checked on the child." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "They said she hid in her room trying to stay safe, but he found her anyway. The landlord said the father paced that room for hours after, back and forth, back and forth. The police found him 3 days later still walking. He'd had a heart attack, but his body kept moving until it finally collapsed." I felt sick. "Sarah, I need to ask you something. Have you been in that room recently?" "I don't use that room anymore. I keep it locked." She pulled out her keys and showed me a small brass key. "But sometimes the door's open when I come home, and the light is on." "What light?" "A yellow light, like a night light. But there's no electricity running to that room. I had it disconnected when I moved in because the wiring was old and dangerous." We stood in the hallway, 2 adults frightened by something we couldn't explain. Sarah rubbed her temples. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Sometimes I hear my name being called, a child's voice, very faint, like someone calling for their mother." "Does it sound like Emma?" "That's the thing, it doesn't. It sounds like someone else's child, someone who's been calling for a very long time." The yellow light suddenly made perfect sense. A night light. A little girl's attempt to keep the monsters away in the dark. That night, I couldn't bring myself to go to bed. I sat in my living room with every light on, waiting. At 11:47 p.m., the familiar yellow glow appeared under my bedroom wall. At midnight, the pacing began. But this time, I heard something else. a soft scratching sound, like small fingernails against wood. It came from inside the wall, right at the spot where the light was strongest. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward my bedroom. The scratching was getting louder, more frantic. I pressed my ear to the wall.
Help me.
The voice was so faint I almost missed it.
Please help me.
I ran outside and pounded on Sarah's door. After a long moment I heard footsteps, then the chain lock rattling. "What's wrong?" she asked, opening the door just a crack. Her face was pale, eyes wide. I heard her, the voice. She asked me to help her. Sarah's face went white. "You heard her speak?" She said, "Help me, please help me." It was coming from inside the wall. Oh God. Sarah opened the door wider, revealing she was fully dressed despite the late hour. I heard it too, but from my side, she was saying something else. "What?" She kept saying Mama over and over, like she was looking for her mother. Sarah's voice broke. "I've been sitting by the wall for hours, just listening. I think she's confused. She thinks I'm her mother." "Sarah, this is insane. We need to call someone." "Who? The police? They'll think we're crazy." She stepped closer, her voice urgent. "But what if she's really there? What if she's been trapped all this time?" "You want to check the wall? I have a sledgehammer in my storage unit. We could." "No!" I backed away. "This is too much. We need to leave. Both of us." Sarah grabbed my arm. "We can't just leave her. She's been calling for help for 15 years, and we're the first people who can hear her. Because we're the first people stupid enough to stay this long. Listen to me." Sarah's grip tightened. "My daughter is the same age as that little girl was. If Emma was trapped somewhere, calling for help, wouldn't you want someone to try? Wouldn't you want someone to care?" I stared at her, realizing she was right. "What are you suggesting?" "Help me get into that room. Help me find out what happened to her. And if we find something we can't handle?" Sarah's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Then at least we'll know. At least someone will finally know." Back in my apartment, the pacing had stopped. The scratching had stopped. But the light was brighter now, more intense, casting a warm circle on my bedroom floor. At 2:15 a.m., the crying began as usual. But tonight, I could hear other sounds mixed in. Adult footsteps, heavy and threatening, a door slamming, a man's voice, slurred and angry, shouting words I couldn't make out. The crying became screaming. I grabbed a hammer from my toolbox and began hitting the wall where the light was strongest. The drywall cracked and crumbled. Behind it, I found something that made my hands shake so badly I dropped the hammer. Scratches, dozens of them carved deep into the wooden beam. Small, desperate marks, like a child trying to claw her way out, and written in a shaky hand with what looked like the color of rust over and over. "Help me, help me, help me." The light was coming from inside the wall, not electrical, something else, something impossible. I kept tearing at the drywall, chunks falling to the floor. The crying was getting louder, more desperate. The scratching returned, coming from somewhere deeper in the wall. That's when I found the cavity. It was small, maybe 2 feet square, hidden between the support beams. Just large enough for a child to crawl into, to hide. The smell hit me first, sweet and rotten like flowers, left too long in water. The yellow light was stronger now, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. I shined my flashlight into the space. I immediately wished I had it. The bones were tiny, delicate, still wearing scraps of a yellow nightgown. One small hand was pressed against the wall facing my bedroom. Fingers splayed as if she'd been trying to push through. The other hand clutched something plastic, A small night light, its cord trailing into the darkness. The crying stopped, my flashlight flickered, and in that instant her body had vanished. In the sudden silence I heard something else. Footsteps coming from Sarah's apartment. The same heavy, measured pace I'd been hearing every night. 10 steps toward the front of the room. Pause. 10 steps back. I stumbled backward from the wall, my flashlight beam dancing crazily across the ceiling. The footsteps were getting closer, moving toward the shared wall, toward the cavity where she'd hidden, where she'd died, where her soul was still hiding. I ran. I packed a bag and left that night, staying in a motel until I could find another apartment. I never went back, not even for my security deposit. I told the landlord there was a gas leak, but sometimes in my new place, I wake up at 2:15 a.m. and think I hear crying, soft and heartbroken, like a child who's been waiting too long for someone to help her. The yellow light appears sometimes too, just a gentle glow under my bedroom door, warm and steady. I tell myself it's just the hallway light, or maybe light from outside, but I know that's not true. She's looking for someone who will finally hear her, someone who will help her, and I'm starting to think that following me was the only way she could make sure I never stop listening. The scratching started again last night. Welcome, sleepwalkers. Make sure to lock your doors. Please like and subscribe before you pass out. Here's today's video. Have you ever wondered if the person that's sitting next to you on the bus or walking past you on the street might be carrying thoughts that would absolutely terrify you? What if I told you that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who think they're perfectly normal? Today, I'm going to tell you a story that will make you question everything you think you know about the mind of someone who's completely lost touch with reality. My name is David, and I want you to understand something about me right from the start. I'm not a monster. I'm not some cartoon villain cackling in the shadows. I'm just a guy who feels deeply about people, maybe too deeply. I work at a small accounting firm downtown. I drive a Honda Civic, and I have a cat named Fitzgerald. I volunteer at the local animal shelter on weekends, and I've never even gotten a speeding ticket. By all accounts, I'm exactly the kind of neighbor you'd want living next door. But lately, people have been acting strange around me. They cross the street when they see me coming, they avoid making eye contact, and yesterday I overheard my coworker Janet whispering something about me being creepy. Creepy? Me? The guy who remembers everyone's birthday and always brings extra coffee for the office. The guy who helped Mrs. Lopez carry her groceries up 3 flights of stairs just last week. I don't understand what's wrong with everyone else, but I'm starting to think maybe they're the ones with the problem. Let me tell you about Ramona, beautiful Ramona with the auburn hair that catches the light just perfectly when she walks past the coffee shop every morning at exactly 8:15. I noticed her about 6 months ago, and I knew instantly that we were meant to be together. Call it fate, call it destiny, call it whatever you want. But some connections transcend normal social conventions. I could tell by the way she carried herself, the books she read on the bus, the way she ordered her coffee. We were soulmates. Now, I know what you're thinking. David, did you actually talk to her? Did you introduce yourself? And the answer is, of course I did my research first. You don't just walk up to your future wife and start babbling like an idiot. You need to know about her, understand her, appreciate the intricate details that make her who she is. So I started paying attention, real attention. I learned that Ramona works at the bakery on 5th Street, that she takes her lunch at the park on Tuesdays, and that she has a small scar in her left hand that she probably got as a child. She drives a blue Toyota and her license plate has the numbers 847 in it, which I think might be significant because 8 plus 4 plus 7 equals 19, and we're both 19 letters apart in the alphabet if you count from our first names. These aren't random coincidences. This is the universe trying to tell us something. I started timing my errands to match her schedule, not following her exactly, just being in the same places at the same times. Natural encounters, you understand, organic meetings. But every time I worked up the courage to approach her, something would interfere. Other people would get in the way. She'd be on her phone, or she'd seem distracted. It was like the universe was testing my patience, seeing if I was truly worthy of her attention. So I decided to be more proactive. I found out where she lived, through completely legitimate means, I might add. Her address was listed in a charity event program I found at the coffee shop. Public information. I started walking past her building on my evening jogs just to get a feel for her neighborhood, to understand the environment that shaped her. Sometimes I'd see lights on in what I assumed was her apartment window, and I'd feel this warm breeze, like we were sharing the same evening air. One night, I noticed her porch light was burnt out. This was clearly a safety hazard, and as someone who valued her well-being, I couldn't just ignore it. So I bought a replacement bulb and went over to fix it. Simple neighborly kindness, right? But when I was up on the stepladder, I happened to glance through her window, and I saw her sitting on her couch, reading. She looked so peaceful, so beautiful in her natural element. I didn't mean to watch her for as long as I did. Time just seemed to stop. I was mesmerized by the way she turned the pages, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the way she stretched like a cat when she got up for tea. It was like watching poetry in motion. But then some paranoid neighbor must have called the police, because suddenly there were flashlights and voices demanding to know what I was doing. Can you believe the misunderstanding? Here I was, performing an act of kindness, making sure Ramona's home was safe and well lit, and these officers treated me like some kind of criminal. I tried to explain about the burnt bulb, about being concerned for her safety, but they just kept asking invasive questions about why I was there so late, how I knew where she lived, whether I'd been there before. They made me feel like I was the bad guy when all I'd been trying to do was help. They told me to stay away from her building, which was completely unreasonable. How was I supposed to ensure she was safe if I couldn't even check on her? But I'm a law-abiding citizen, so I respected their request, even though it pained me. Instead, I found other ways to stay connected to Ramona's life. Social media is a wonderful thing when you really think about it. It allows people to share their lives with those who value them. Ramona posted pictures of her morning coffee, her weekend hiking trips, her dinners with friends. I made sure to like every single post because I wanted her to know that someone was paying attention, that someone appreciated all the little details that made her special. I left thoughtful comments too, showing her that I really understood her personality, her interests, her dreams. But instead of appreciating my attention, Ramona did something that really hurt me. She blocked me. Just like that, she cut off our relationship without any explanation. I couldn't understand it. All I'd done was show interest in her life, support her posts, engage with her content the way social media was designed for. What kind of person blocks someone for being attentive? I realized then that Ramona was probably just scared. Society teaches women to be suspicious of genuine male attention, to mistake devotion for something sinister. She'd been conditioned to fear the very qualities that make a man a good partner: attentiveness, dedication, the willingness to prioritize her well-being above everything else. I felt sorry for her, really. She was probably longing for someone to truly see her, but years of social programming had made her push away exactly what she needed most. So I decided to take a different approach. If direct digital communication made her nervous, I'd find more subtle ways to let her know I was thinking about her. I started leaving small gifts, nothing expensive or flashy, just thoughtful tokens that showed I paid attention to her preferences. A single sunflower on her car because I'd seen her post a picture of a sunflower field. A copy of a book by an author she'd mentioned liking, left on her doorstep with a note saying it was from a secret admirer. Little gestures that would brighten her day and maybe help her understand that someone out there truly valued her happiness. But the world seemed determined to misinterpret my kindness. Ramona apparently told her friends about the gifts, and they convinced her it was something to worry about instead of something to cherish. They probably filled her head with paranoid thoughts about stalkers and dangerous men. The situation escalated when Ramona went to the police again. This time, they came to my apartment with something called a restraining order. Can you imagine? They treated my expressions of affection like they were threats, my thoughtful gestures like they were harassment. The officer who served me the papers spoke to me like I was some kind of predator, warning me about the consequences of violating the order, making it sound like I'd done something terrible when all I'd done was feel too much. I tried to explain to him about the connection Ramona and I shared, about how these restrictions were interfering with something beautiful and natural. I told him about the numerical significance of our names, about the way the universe kept putting us in the same places at the same times, about how she probably didn't really want this restraining order but felt pressured by her paranoid friends to get it. But he just gave me this look, like I was speaking a foreign language, like he couldn't understand that some things transcend conventional social boundaries. The worst part was having to stay 500 feet away from her. Do you know how arbitrary that distance is? Why 500 feet and not 400 or 600? What's magical about that specific measurement? It meant I couldn't even grab coffee from our coffee shop anymore. Couldn't take my usual route to work. Couldn't jog through the park where I sometimes caught glimpses of her during lunch breaks. They were asking me to restructure my entire life around avoiding someone I cherished. But I'm nothing if not adaptable. If Ramona needed space to come to terms with her feelings, I could give her that space while still keeping an eye on her well-being from a distance. I started using binoculars from my apartment window, which had a partial view of her street, just to make sure she was safe, you understand. To watch for any signs that she might be in trouble or need help. The restraining order said I couldn't approach her, but it didn't say I couldn't worry about her from afar. I also created new social media accounts to keep track of her posts, not to interact with them. I respected the boundaries she'd set up, even though I didn't agree with them. I just needed to know she was okay, that she was eating properly, that she wasn't making any dangerous decisions. She'd been posting about going hiking alone in remote areas, which was incredibly risky behavior. What if she got injured? What if she encountered dangerous wildlife? What if her car broke down in a place with no cell service? Someone needed to be concerned about these things. So I started following her hiking trails, always maintaining the required distance, of course. I'd park my car at different trailheads and use the binoculars to make sure she made it to her destination safely and back to her vehicle without incident. I told myself I was like an unofficial guardian angel, someone looking out for her well-being when no one else seemed concerned about the risks she was taking. But apparently, even this level of protection was somehow problematic. Ramona must have spotted me on one of these protective excursions, because the next thing I knew, the police were at my door again. This time, they weren't just serving papers, they were arresting me for violating the restraining order, treating me like a common criminal when all I'd been doing was making sure the woman I loved didn't get eaten by a bear or fall off a cliff somewhere. In the holding cell, I had a lot of time to think about how society has warped people's understanding of genuine attention and devotion. We live in a world where people are more afraid of someone feeling too much than they are of genuine threats like drunk drivers or violent criminals. We've created a culture where devotion is criminalized and indifference is celebrated. It's no wonder so many people feel disconnected and alone when expressing real interest in someone's life is treated like a crime. The court-appointed psychologist they made me see didn't understand either. She kept using words like obsession and boundaries and inappropriate behavior, as if there were something wrong with feeling deeply about another person's safety and happiness. She talked about empathy and consent like they were foreign concepts to me, when the truth is I have more empathy than most people can handle. I feel things more deeply, invest more intensely. If anything, the world needs more people like me, not fewer. She tried to convince me that my behavior was causing Ramona distress, but I knew better. Ramona was confused, influenced by friends and family members who didn't understand, probably scared by societal messaging about men who show genuine interest. Deep down, she had to appreciate that someone noticed the little things. She just needed time to work through the fear and conditioning that society had imposed on her. During our sessions, the psychologist kept asking me to imagine how my actions might feel from Ramona's perspective. But that's exactly what I'd been doing all along. Everything I did was motivated by thinking about Ramona's perspective, about what would make her happy, about what she needed even when she didn't know she needed it herself. I was probably the first person in her life to pay such careful attention to her inner world. The psychologist suggested that maybe my intense feelings were actually about my own needs rather than Ramona's, which was completely backwards. If I'd been thinking about my own needs, I would have approached her directly instead of being so patient and considerate. I would have demanded her attention instead of expressing my devotion through thoughtful gestures. Everything I did was about putting her first, about being the kind of man who notices when someone's porch light burns out, who remembers their favorite flower, who worries when they take unnecessary risks. After several months of mandatory therapy sessions and community service, they finally released me from the legal system's grip. The psychologist said she hoped I'd learned to respect other people's boundaries, which showed she still didn't understand what I'd been trying to accomplish. Boundaries are artificial constructs that prevent genuine human interaction. They're barriers that keep people isolated and lonely, walls that stop love from flourishing naturally. But I told her what she wanted to hear, because I knew the only way to get back to my normal life was to play along with their misconceptions. I nodded when she talked about appropriate social interactions, agreed when she mentioned the importance of consent, promised to respect other people's stated wishes even when I knew better than they did what would actually make them happy. Sometimes you have to work within a broken system to achieve your real goals. Now I'm back to my regular routine, but everything feels different. People at work avoid me even more than before, like I'm carrying some kind of contagious disease. My neighbors won't make eye contact, and I've noticed more police patrols in my area as if I'm some kind of threat to public safety. All because I felt too much about someone, because I wanted to make sure a beautiful person stayed safe and secure in an increasingly dangerous world. Ramona has moved away, which breaks my heart because I know how she felt about this city. She had to uproot her entire life, leave her job and her friends and her favorite coffee shop, all because society convinced her that genuine affection was something to fear. I hope wherever she is now, someone is looking out for her the way I did. Sometimes I wonder if I should try to find out where she went, just to make sure she's settling in okay. But I know the system would misinterpret those motivations too, would treat natural concern like it's something nefarious. So for now, I have to trust that the universe will take watch over her, even though I'm not there to help anymore. I've been thinking about finding someone new to focus on, someone who might be more open to genuine attention and devotion. Maybe someone younger, less influenced by society's paranoid messages about male interest. Someone who would appreciate having a person in their life who really pays attention. Someone who understands that intense feelings are a gift, not a threat. But I'm being more strategic now about how I express that devotion. I'm learning to be more subtle, more patient, more calculated about how I show someone that they matter to me. The feelings are still there, that deep capacity for connection, that ability to see people as they really are, that willingness to prioritize someone else's well-being above my own comfort. I just need to find better ways to channel those feelings, ways that won't be misunderstood. Because at the end of the day, I'm not the problem here. I'm not the one who's broken or dangerous or wrong. I'm just someone who loves fully, but I haven't given up hope. Somewhere out there is someone who will understand that my intensity comes from a place of pure affection. Someone who will appreciate having a person in their life who notices everything, remembers everything, puts their needs above everything else. Someone who won't be frightened, who won't mistake love for something darker. And when I find that person, I'll be ready. I'll be smarter about how I approach them, more strategic about respecting society's arbitrary rules, more meticulous about expressing my feelings. Until then, I'm just a normal guy, living a normal life, working at my accounting firm, taking responsibility for Fitzgerald, volunteering at the animal shelter. So the next time you see someone paying close attention to the details of your life, remembering your favorite things, showing up in places where you spend time, maybe don't assume the worst. Maybe consider that you've encountered someone rare in this disconnected world, someone who thinks you're worth watching over, someone who sees you as more than just another anonymous face in the crowd. Maybe what you've found isn't a threat at all. Maybe it's exactly what you've been missing without even knowing it. Maybe it's love in its purest form. And maybe, just maybe, The problem isn't with people like me who feel too much. Maybe the problem is with a world that's forgotten how to truly connect. Am I the psycho? Or am I just the only one who remembers what it means to really, truly love? I wonder how Ramona is doing. Maybe I should check up on her in her new neighborhood just to make sure she's safe.